Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. 2 years ago, we broke the story about a study that found very peculiar anomalies within the genomic sequence of the COVID virus. Those anomalies all pointed to a lab leak. But other than Anthony Fauci's group of natural origin activists, we might have been the only ones who realized the significance of that study. Unlike us, who reported about the facts, Fauci's group immediately started a smear campaign against the scientists who wrote the paper. Fauci-funded Christian Anderson called the authors worse than kindergarten biologists. Well, there's a new bundle of FOIA documents that prove that the scientists who wrote the paper were absolutely right all along. There's a new Freedom of Information document release that proves beyond any doubt that the COVID virus came out of a lab. Now, you might say that we already knew that, and you'd be right. But this time, it's just on a very different level. We're talking O.J. Simpson's glove at the scene of the crime kind of level. It's the level of detail, granular detail, that sets this new document release apart from everything else we've seen so far, and we've obviously seen a lot already. Now, first off, it might be worth pointing out once more that every single time new documents have been unveiled in this 4-year COVID origin saga, they always point in the direction of a lab origin. We have never seen any documents released or new information come forward that has pointed in the opposite direction. Never. And so it is this time as well, but just on an incredible level in terms of the value and quality of the evidence. If this were a court of law, the jury would come back in 2 milliseconds with a guilty verdict. It's just that damning. What makes this new document release so powerful is that the documents show in great detail how the Wuhan lab and Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance, the group through which Fauci funded the Wuhan lab, had a blueprint for making COVID in a lab, and that blueprint perfectly matches COVID. It's like finding the criminal's diary where they plan how exactly the crime will be carried out. And then that plan just happens to perfectly match what actually happened. Now, by way of background, we have known about this blueprint for a while. The Wuhan lab, EcoHealth, a guy called Ralph Baric from the University of North Carolina, the so-called godfather of gain of function, and a lady called Tony Rock from the US Department of the Interior wrote this blueprint in 2018. We'll get back to these people later, but for now, the most important thing to note is that all these people should have immediately told the public about this blueprint when COVID arrived, especially if they were innocent. But they did not. When COVID arrived, they all worked overtime to conceal the existence of the blueprint. Eventually, in 2021, someone leaked the blueprint to Origin search group Drastic. It was in many ways the final piece of evidence we needed to prove that COVID came out of a lab, and we said so at the time. But there was pushback from Fauci's crew and from their lackeys in the media. They said the blueprint was too general and not necessarily about making COVID. They said the plan wasn't specific enough about COVID's furin cleavage site, the very peculiar genetic feature of COVID that has never been observed in any natural SARS virus, but which makes the virus so virulent and pathogenic in humans. They said the blueprint hadn't been executed. They said that even if the blueprint had been executed, all the work was going to be done in North Carolina and not in Wuhan. Well, now we have proof, cast iron proof, that all those objections were false and that the blueprint perfectly matches COVID. So how are the new documents different from the previously leaked blueprint? In a nutshell, the previously leaked blueprint was the final product. It was the 30-page project plan which EcoHealth submitted to the Pentagon seeking $15 million to make these dangerous viruses in a lab, supposedly in North Carolina. The Pentagon rejected the blueprint because it was far too risky and because EcoHealth had not even bothered to explain how that risk was going to be mitigated. Now, in contrast, the new FOIA documents comprise 1,412 pages worth of emails, draft documents, and discussions about the 30-page blueprint. In other words, we get to see all the thinking and details that went into the blueprint, but which did not make it into the final version when it was cut down to 30 pages. And that's what makes this new document bundle so incredibly valuable. But before we get into all the new details revealed in those 1,412 pages worth of planning documents, we should talk about the 2022 study which we mentioned at the outset of today's show, because it is an incredibly important benchmark when assessing the new documents. What the authors of the 2022 study did was that they looked at COVID's genomic sequence in minute detail, and they found some glaring anomalies. As mentioned, we did a show on the 2022 study, so we won't rehash it all here, but the basic facts are that the authors found that whoever had made COVID used a very particular enzyme to glue together parts of the virus, that this enzyme was spaced in very regular, non-natural ways, and that COVID had been put together in 6 segments. Now, we don't mean to get into all the details of how gluing together viruses works in labs. So to put it in a nutshell, when you make viruses in labs, you stick together modules, just like Legos. A virus is a sequence of something like 30,000 pieces of genetic information. And so to make life a bit easier, you break it down into smaller segments which you can work on before putting it all back together. And to put it back together, you need so-called restriction sites. These are enzymes which also correspond to genetic information on the virus's genomic sequence, and they act as a kind of glue. Now, there are over 800 possible enzymes that you could use for this task, but COVID features a very particular one, and it is called BSMB1. These restriction sites also occur naturally, which is why they've been selected for use in these experiments. The point is that when these restriction sites occur naturally, they could be any one of the 800 plus that are available, and they would be spaced totally randomly across the genetic code. What the 2022 study found was that the ones in COVID were spaced regularly. And now we know even more. Recall that the 2022 study found that out of the 800 possible choices, BSMB1 had been used. Well, guess which particular restriction site features in the new documents? You guessed it, BSMB1. In fact, there's a shopping list in the new documents which contains orders for both the long and the short versions of BSMB1. Note that while the shopping list calls these R580, that is just a commercial description of BSMB1. Now, that shopping list was not part of the 30-page blueprint which previously leaked. Something else that was cut from the 30-page blueprint, which we found out about for the first time last week, is that EcoHealth and the Wuhan lab plan to construct their viruses using 6 segments. This also matches the observations in the 2022 study, which, based on the amount of BSMB1 sites observed, had predicted that the COVID virus had been constructed from 6 parts. Okay, so some might claim that out of the 800 enzymes, they just happen to use the one that features in COVID, and it's all just coincidences. Well, these things absolutely stop being coincidences when we get to the furin cleavage site. Again, we don't want to make this an advanced science class, so to put it simply, the furin cleavage site is, as already mentioned, the feature in COVID that makes it so virulent in humans. Without the furin cleavage site, COVID would be totally harmless. And so when the COVID virus showed up in late 2019 with a furin cleavage site, everyone who knows about these things knew right away that that was a huge red flag, because no natural SARS viruses had ever been found with such a site. The leaked 30-page blueprint had mentioned inserting furin cleavage sites, but it was not very specific. What's new is that the new FOIA documents give us a lot of additional information about what exactly EcoHealth and the Wuhan lab wanted to do with those fear and cleavage sites. All the people who claimed that the blueprint wasn't about inserting COVID-like fear and cleavage sites into coronaviruses were wrong, totally wrong. That is exactly what the Wuhan lab and EcoHealth wanted to do, and the new documents prove it. The part highlighted in blue here was removed from the final draft, and not only does it show that fear and cleavage sites were to be inserted into coronaviruses, but it also shows that EcoHealth and the Wuhan lab knew that there were no natural occurrences of such sites and that such sites were needed for human transmission. So all that information was in the draft documents, but it was later removed before the final draft was sent to the Pentagon, perhaps because EcoHealth and the Wuhan lab did not want to alert their funders in the US government to how much they already knew about what a fear and cleavage site would do in terms of making viruses more virulent in humans. Something else that's in the deleted part, which they did not want to alert anyone about, is that some of the work had already been done. Recall how the original excuse was that this was just a rough blueprint and that the work had never been done. Well, that turns out to be false. It's right there where they say for SARS coronaviruses, a variety of cleavage sites in S have also been identified. They knew exactly what they were doing, and that takes us to another huge smoking gun, which is the location of the fear and cleavage site. Previously, Fauci's gang had insisted that even if the blueprint was about inserting fear and cleavage sites into coronaviruses, we have no idea where they were going to insert these sites. Well, guess what? Now we do have that information because it's contained in an image which EcoHealth and the Wuhan lab drew up for their draft proposal, but then left out of the final version. Here's that image. You can clearly see that the plan was to insert these fear and cleavage sites at what is called the S1 and S2 junction, which denotes a particular spot in the genomic sequence. Well, guess where COVID's fear and cleavage site is? That's right, it's at the S1 and S2 junction. So everything that the 2022 study, which had been ridiculed by Fauci's crew, predicted turned out to be true. And every excuse provided by Fauci's gang as to why we should ignore the 2018 blueprint turned out to be untrue. What we now have with these new documents is proof beyond reasonable doubt that the blueprint was not only for something similar to COVID, but for something exactly like COVID. And it gets worse. Remember how we were also told that the work was going to be done at the University of North Carolina? Well, that part too turned out to be a lie. The new documents show that North Carolina was just a pretext. EcoHealth was going to shift the work to Wuhan as soon as they got money from the US government. Oh, and to cut corners, they were going to do the work at low biosafety level 2, which is something else that was not mentioned in the final version of the blueprint. In fact, the part about low biosafety level was removed because Ralph Baric told Peter Daszak that US scientists would, and we quote, freak out if they knew about that. Daszak also admits in these new documents that he deliberately downplayed the central role to be played by Chinese scientists in order not to jeopardize his chances of getting money from the Pentagon. The origin case is closed. COVID came out of a lab based on the 2018 blueprint. What remains to be determined is who did what. Did the Wuhan lab take the blueprint and just go ahead on their own and make COVID? That's an absolutely plausible scenario to anyone who knows China. Get the godfather of gain of function in the United States to write up a detailed roadmap and then execute on that roadmap behind his back. Absolutely possible. Or did the work go ahead with full participation of that godfather, Ralph Baric, and EcoHealth? That's also possible. Or was it something in between, whereby Barrick and EcoHealth participated to some extent, but then the Wuhan lab just ran with it on their own? We know that all the participants in the blueprint had a mysterious meeting with Fauci's NIAID in October of 2019. We don't know what happened at that meeting. One last point we should make is how absolutely disgraceful it is that none of the people involved in drafting this blueprint came forward in 2020 when COVID arrived to tell us about the blueprint. That goes especially for Barrick, particularly if he only helped to draft the blueprint and did not do the actual work. And that also applies to Tony Rock, an employee with the federal government's Department of the Interior who helped Daszak with the blueprint. Why didn't she come forward? Why did all this information need to be pried out of the government's hands? On that note, we should say thank you to a group called US Right to Know, a government transparency group that fights the government, often in court, in order to get documents like the latest FOIA bundle. They do yeoman's work, without which we'd still be in the dark. Thanks for joining us in today's episode of Truth Over News.